And so, honestly, what happened for me, Peter, is I got to the point where I was tired of hearing what the United States was saying about the war in Ukraine. I was tired of hearing what Russia was saying about the war in Ukraine. I was tired of hearing what Ukraine was saying about the war in Ukraine. And I just wanted to see it for myself. That's what this was. I just wanted to see it for myself. So that's what I did.
Hey, folks, welcome to Uncommon Sense in Current Times. I'm here today. I'm excited to be here with Stephen Solomon. Stephen just got back from Ukraine where he filmed a documentary on what's happening in Ukraine called What Does Freedom Cost? And I'm excited to talk to him about what he saw and what does the movie show and depict. So, Stephen, thank you so much for coming on the show.
Hey, Peter, thanks so much for having me, man. It's good to see you.
So all right, you turn on the news. We've been hearing about Ukraine. It seems like forever. Even though, like, it kind of the timeline, it's really not as bad, especially when it's not involving us directly. You hear people complain about the money we send over there. You hear some people say we need to send troops to stop Putin. Some people say we need to stay completely out of it. There doesn't seem to be a whole lot of lines drawn politically on alliances there. So kind of give us an update. Just what's going on in Ukraine and and why should we even care?
Oh, wow. I guess the second part is the most pressing conversation. Why should we even care? Let me put it this way. So, do you remember when the war first began? I think maybe 3 years ago. Do you remember how everybody was like gung ho, really supportive of Ukraine?
Yeah,
And
absolutely. Yeah.
yeah, everybody had like the Ukraine pin, and on social media, everybody was putting the Ukraine flag. I mean, that was a big deal. Well, 3 years have gone by, and like you just talked about, like, why should we still care? It's because billions and billions and billions have been spent. We got kind of tired, right?
Right.
And so the whole shift of supporting Ukraine's got to win, that kind of all went out the window. Especially over the last year, at least from my perspective. I don't know what you've been seeing, but man, that's what I've been seeing. Listen, and at the same time, we're hearing the government say, well, we don't have any money for them, but we do have a whole bunch of money for Ukraine. So it was this very weird feeling of we can't take care of our own place, but we can take care of them. And that's really what spawned all this. Is I just wanted to see it for myself. I was tired of just hearing it from a bunch of sources.
So did you?
Sources.
Yeah. Did you follow the Hunter Biden trail while you were there?
Oh, yeah, and I took a bunch of kickbacks, so I got a couple $100 million, like, to a couple shell companies for sure. Yeah, speak to me after. I'll make sure you get a slice of that.
So all right. So obviously, again, we got issues all over. Now your background. I mean, you served. Was it in Afghanistan or Iraq? I
Yeah,
can't remember, or both.
I was in the army. Yeah, both. I was an intel agent in the army in the early days of the Iraq and Afghanistan wars. Yeah.
So for you, like making this decision to go to Ukraine, uh, you was not like the necessarily as much of a fear factor as I'm sure based off of your experiences it would be for someone like me.
Yeah, isn't it weird, man? People think about war, and what's the first thing you think of when you think of war?
Uh,
Like movies or scenes?
yeah. Band of Brothers, like yeah,
Band of Brothers,
yes,
nailed it.
something
World
like
War
that. Yeah,
II, trench warfare, one side, another side fighting each other, that
right.
sort of. That's not modern war, and even though that's how people think, that's not how it is. And so I think that's hard for civilians who've never been in the military to understand. Is this is not Band of Brothers? This is not World War II. We're living in 2025 now. War looks like people living their lives, going to church, going to the coffee shop, doing podcasts, doing their stuff, and then boom, a building blows up. or drones come over. I mean, it doesn't look like the war that you imagine. Now, what there is over on the very far eastern side of Ukraine, right where Russia came in through that border area, the Donbass region, they call it. There is a lot of push back and forth between the two countries. They're fighting, between each other. But even then, it's not like the entire country is at war. And so I think that's something that people don't realize because we're just trained through Hollywood to believe that. I mean, even myself, let me use myself as an example in Afghanistan, right? Um, in Afghanistan, you've got a big country with millions of people that was at war for many, many years. In fact, our longest running war in the United States. And yet most of the country wasn't really at war. Most of the country was people living their lives. Same with Iraq, right? You got to realize, man, if a country's big, how are you going to bomb the entire country? How is everybody going to be at war? It's kind of an impossibility. So I think a lot of people forget that. And that's just something to maybe keep in mind.
So so in this
Isn't that interesting to think
Yeah,
about?
no, well, and when you say that, it is because when I think about the fact the distance between now and World War II is actually the same distance between World War II and the Civil War.
Is it really?
Yeah, it's basically 80 years in both directions.
No way. That is
Yeah.
crazy to think about.
Yeah, and so when you put it that perspective, I'm thinking, okay, did the people of World War II sit there and try to analyze it based off of Civil War tactic?
Mm,
And
good point.
the thought processes of that? Clearly not.
It's a good
But
point.
but you're right. But they didn't have the media of World War II, et cetera, which is obviously always an incredible storyline for Hollywood or for TV, et cetera. So
Sure.
so
That
now,
was just a different type of war, though. I mean, you got to look
yeah,
at Ukraine. We're talking about Ukraine here. So, Ukraine is a country that's the size of, if you were to take it and place it on the United States map, you have to realize it's going to stretch from, and if I got this right, if my memory serves me correct, it's from Chicago to Boston. Okay.
right.
That's if you were to take it and put it on the map. So, imagine if you live in Chicago and you hear that Canada, just because it's fun, has invaded, right? So let's say Canada invaded Boston and they were fighting over there and lots of people were dying and there was a huge war happening in Boston. But you're in Chicago or Minneapolis or somewhere like that. Okay, you don't feel it. You might have some things happening to you. You might have your men taken from your city and taken to the front lines. You might have some economic struggles because it's affecting the whole country. But you're still getting up and going to school in Chicago. You're still going to work in Chicago. You're still going to the coffee shop. You're just thinking about the war in the East in Boston. That is Ukraine. That's what's happening.
So when you're looking at the what's going on in the ground in Ukraine, and you said you wanted to see because you're hearing it from all the different sides, you're hearing the different stuff, and you wanted to
Yeah.
go and see it. What do you think was probably the most standout thing, the number one thing that when you're looking at to say this, what I saw was so radically different than what I'm being told? What was probably that number one thing that was different?
Oh, the number one thing that was different. Honestly, I think the people's morale
Okay,
that probably stood out a great deal to me. I didn't know what to expect going over there. And again,
right,
like you just mentioned, I spoke to a lot of people. I was speaking to, in fact, it wasn't just in Ukraine. I was even in Moldova, which is a small country
right.
beside Ukraine, and spoke to some people there who are doing refugee center work. But the morale of the Ukrainians, they want to win. They want to be free. They don't want Russia to take over. Um, they also, from the feeling that I got in the conversations that I had, I don't think they believe they're going to win. And many of them directly told me this. They don't think they're going to win the war, many of them. Some of them do. And also the public narrative is different. Uh, I spoke to one of the leaders of the government, the Speaker of the House in a region called Chernovitzy, and I asked him that question. I said, what's the story with your guys' morale and the goal and how does it end? And he goes, we're united behind Zelensky. We're going to win. We're one nation. We're going to fight for our freedom, you know, and that feels like a narrative that I'm hearing in the official terms.
Right.
But when it comes to the people and what they say, it was not that feeling. It was, well, we're going to fight to the last man, but we don't know if it's going to work. especially now that Trump has taken office, because one of the things that Trump has sworn to do is end the war in Ukraine very quickly. How he's going to do that, I'm not quite sure. But pooling funding from Ukraine is an option. So if that happens, who knows? Who knows what happens to Ukraine?
I'm curious, were you there before or after the election?
I
When
was
did
there
you?
literally right before. The last day I was in Ukraine was Halloween, and then
Okay.
what? Like 4 or 5 days later, there was the election. So it was right before.
Did they have, or did you even discuss feelings about, like, were they worried that Trump was coming in, or worried that Harris was going to win? Like, what do they see as their best hope from the United States?
So that was an interesting thing, because I definitely, I mean, you know me, I'm going to ask the question.
Right.
Like, I'm not going to be like beating around the bush with people. I get right to the point. And so with them, I would ask the question, how do you feel about Trump maybe winning again? And I would say things like, Americans are tired of funding your war. What are you guys, how do you feel about that? And they would say things like, well, we have to defeat Putin. We can't let him win. If Putin defeats Ukraine, he's going to go to Poland, which I don't necessarily agree with. If he defeats us, he's going to go to these other former Soviet satellite states. I'm not so sure that's true. Regardless, um, whether they chose Trump or Harris was not a thing. None of them would answer that question.
Huh.
They were all just wanting, honestly, U.S. support, whether it was Ukraine, or excuse me, whether it was Trump or Harris. And it felt like they didn't care either way. They just want the money to keep flowing,
Right, right.
the weapons to keep being purchased and sent.
Do you,
Because they want it, because to them it's not, the U.S. election is great, but they have a war that they're fighting for their survival. So that's what they're concerned about.
well, and we've seen, throughout history many times where political leaders changed and then all of a sudden the whole sides change. I mean,
That's right.
so that's why I was kind of curious if they thought that was going to happen or not, because, and I'm with you. Like, I know Trump is going to address Ukraine. I just don't know how he's going to address Ukraine. It's definitely going to be an issue. So,
Yes. I think what's going to happen, man, is he's going to, if now, again, this is a guess. I'm not in the conversations. Okay. That's not, I'd love to be. I'm not. Those conversations, I think, are going to go this way. If I were to put money on it, Trump will bring Putin and Zelensky together, and he will somehow, if peace is negotiated, it will look like this. It will somehow be that the current state of aggression, the lines that have been crossed, the lands that have been captured and taken, that's the way it is. So Russia has Crimea, which they took in 2014. They have the eastern part of Ukraine, that Donbass region that we talked about, kind of like a strip of land on the right. They have taken that. Again, it goes back and forth. Ukraine retakes it, Russia retakes it. I think the conversation would be, whatever anybody's got right now, that's where it stops. And then we'll call a peace treaty. And maybe we end up with something like a North and South Korea armistice, where there's no
right.
official end of the war, but there's perhaps like an agreement not to shoot each other.
So, all right. So you arrive, and and again, war is obviously different, as we talked about.
Yeah.
Um, but were you able to get a feeling there, or were you able to have conversations with people there on how on earth Ukraine has lasted 3 months? Because money can provide weapons, but you still got to have. I mean, you still got to have the manpower, you still got to have the
Yeah.
experience, you still got to have the leadership, you still got to have all of that stuff that's important, that goes beyond just money. If it was just money,
Yeah.
we would already have conquered the world. Us and China, it would just be just the two of us. So how on earth, in your opinion, based off what you saw, has Ukraine been able to hold off for 3 years?
Um, well, like, one part is the money, weaponry. That's a big deal. You also have to realize that Russia has sustained a lot of casualties, and so has Ukraine. We're over 1 million people now in this war that have died. That's a lot of
That's a
people.
lot of
That's
people.
a million people is a lot of people.
And
And
we
I
got a
talked to one
border.
of the,
We got a border that we can probably just send them across from our border.
oh my goodness, they just keep loading them up. I mean, I don't know if you saw this or not, but Russia brought in North Korean troops.
Yeah.
They were just like, well, I don't know, maybe we should hire the Asians to do this for us. It's so many people they've lost, and so that's a big deal. Remember World War? We talked about World War II. How did the Russians defeat the Germans? Do you remember?
Just yeah,
Remember?
time, and it got cold, and they just outdied them basically. They just
Yes,
yeah,
they threw bodies at them.
yeah, yeah.
Yeah, it just a
It's
whole bunch of Russians.
it's been their
Somebody
pattern
they
since Napoleon.
it's how they do it, you know, and it's crazy to think about it. And so like the stories from World War II where people would literally be running in the battlefield to go toward the Nazis. They didn't have weapons in their hands, and they would wait for somebody to die and then pick up their weapon. And you know, and it's just so many men, so many people. Russia has lost a lot of people. I think Ukraine is at an inflection point. You asked how they lasted this long. By the skin of their teeth. They've suffered a lot. They've lost a lot of people. There's been a lot of suffering and tragedy in Ukraine. And
Have you ever been stranded with a flat tire in the middle of nowhere? My first semester home from college, I was driving back to college, and that's what happened. I was halfway between two places, a couple miles from the exits, and I had to walk miles in the cold to get to a phone. That's why I would have loved at that point in time to have Air Moto, and that's why I bought it for my wife and kids, especially when they're traveling to remote places. With Air Moto, they don't have to depend on anyone else for help. They don't have to depend on walking or waiting in their car, hoping that nobody comes along while they're waiting for their friends or family to pick them up. This compact, high quality tool is always ready to go. You can put it right in the glove box, and it can actually inflate all four vehicle tires in a matter of minutes. It's powerful, it's reliable, and it gives my family peace of mind. Airmoto keeps us prepared for all the things that can happen to us with our tires while we're going. It's a great Christmas gift this year, and it'll just help you kind of just feel very comfortable for your wife and family as they travel. So, highly encourage you to get it. You can go to airmoto.com, or you can check out the link below in there and click through the link in order to order yours today.
I don't know how much longer they can go. I don't know how much longer Russia can go. That's why I think peace and an opportunity for some sort of truce or an end to the war is a real thing that could happen. But who knows? There's also a lot of animosity there. The Ukrainians used to be a part of the Soviet Union, and so they are culturally connected to the Russians, very close. Many of them speak Russian. You know, I'd say most of them do. Um, and as a matter of fact, in Ukraine, one of the psychological elements of the war is people won't speak Russian to each other in Ukraine just because they don't want to speak the language of the person who invaded them.
Oh,
So
wow.
they'll speak Ukrainian instead, even though Russian is understood by more people. And a lot of times when you have interpreters and stuff, and somebody might not speak Ukrainian or English, but they almost always speak Russian. So Russian kind of becomes the default language to use for, translating. But Ukrainians don't really want to use Russian because, they've been invaded. So they're like, we don't want to speak Russian. So they'll even make conversations more difficult out of principle because they don't want to speak the language of Russia.
Okay. So that's kind of like, yeah. So now we're talking about on the ground and just kind of the civilians and things that they're doing there. What else did you see that was there, like that wasn't in the battles? That was just kind of in the yeah, just kind of, I won't say day-to-day living,
Sure.
but what did you see there that was kind of striking to you?
Um, it's striking the East-West divide. People on the East are very much focused on the war because that's where the war is taking place.
Right?
And so it is wartime. I mean, they are focused on the war. People in the West, it's a thing that's happening, but it's not impacting them daily. So it's just like, oh, here's another story from the East. Another raid happened, another rocket launched, another building was destroyed, another group of people were killed. And it's more what's happening over there and not what's happening here. So there's like a split in the psyche of the people of Ukraine because so many of them are so far from the war, right? People on the western side of Ukraine they're nowhere near the battles. They're not even close. The people in the middle and the eastern sides of Ukraine, they're really close to it. They get sirens happening all the time, air raids happening all the time, deaths happening all the time. So there's a big difference between the two as far as their psyches.
Is that the primary, is from the air or drone strikes, or is that where the primary um, um, casualties coming from within Ukraine is from Russian air, or is it also
Man, it's
on
these
ground?
drones. These drones. I can't stress to you how much war has changed. Um, the drones have changed everything. They're everywhere. They will. One man, it was a pastor, I believe, I interviewed, and he said he's a pastor of a town. There were 30,000 people in his, or there were 300,000 people in his town, and now there's 30,000. People have fled or died. And he says he has seen drones just chasing men and women and children through the streets, shooting them. I mean, it's
Oh,
just
wow.
wild. It's wild to think about the type of wars that we're in now. And so the fear, these things are super cheap too. It's not like they're really expensive. You can make a drone for pretty cheap. And you don't have, there's no person have to fly it. So no one's going to die that's flying it. So it
Right.
saves the soldier's life. They get to hunt people down and cause damage through these very cheaply made, devices. And so it's totally changed the nature of war. It's there's still tanks, there's still weapons, there's still soldiers on the ground. That's where a lot of trench fighting is happening on the east. But the introduction of drones into this thing, it has forever changed war. Not just in Ukraine, the rest of the world. When it's time to fight wars, will be using drones at mass.
So, but yeah, I can't imagine. Like I'm picturing myself now. Like, okay, if that were to happen here, because that's the thing with drones. When what Hamas did to Israel, and I thought, man, you look at a music festival, and right down the road from us, there's Bonnaroo, and I'm like, what if that happened? We couldn't muster up a response fast enough. The local police are ill-equipped. The
Yeah.
National Guard, could get there, but by the time they arrived, there's, so we would struggle, obviously, if something were like that were to happen. And so now I kind of put myself in this position. If we were in a situation where they were either bombing our cities and then the remaining people running were getting chased by fast weapons that could shoot at them from the air, yeah, that I don't know how does one even have a morale that you can possibly survive unless you can attack in the opposite direction and have mutually assured destruction, almost, type of like deterrence theory. I don't know how you could possibly overcome that.
And the drones, I think, are causing a great deal of morale decline, like you discussed. That's a big deal. It's we're still figuring it out. It's a new technology as far as warfare is concerned. So we've not seen a war. I think this might be the very first war where drones were the primary, form of weaponry, obviously aside from shelling and tanks and things like that. And so this is new. It's being figured out. The countermeasures are being introduced. You talk about how would the U.S. respond? I mean, look at, I don't know if you remember it or not, but I think it's happened twice actually. There was a Chinese balloon that kind of floated
Yeah.
across the United, right? Okay, just come on, crazy, right? And then all of the drones that happened in Jersey
Right.
recently, and everyone was freaking out. Is it aliens? Is it Iran? There were so many competing arguments. Is it our own government? Are they civilians? Drones are here to stay, and we're figuring out their usage, especially when it comes to our safety. It is just one of those things where they can fly really high. They are cheaply made. They can drop bombs. They can shoot bullets. They can have infrared scanners on them. They can detect where people are, even if they're hiding. And if they're destroyed, you can send in 10,000 more really cheap, as opposed to a bunch of, raptors flying through the air. And so it's an interesting, brave new world. I don't know how you combat it. I'm not a technical weapons expert, so I don't know what the
You're
answer
right.
is. Maybe there's a maybe it's electromagnetic stuff. Maybe you can shoot lasers into the air in a grid and it shuts down drones. I don't know, but it's a scary thing for a lot of people.
So here in the U.S., we have a tornado come hit a city, or we have a power outage. We immediately have issues with looting. We have issues
Yeah.
with, I mean, are they having those same problems? Because I would imagine a drone blowing up a building is similar than a tornado hitting a building. So, at least as far as damage goes on some level, uh, are they having those same type of issues there?
Of looting,
Yeah, looting or other types of violence that you would see here in the United States in a kind of an isolated area when you have those type of.
I mean, there's still crime and there's still corruption as
Oh,
with
there
any
always will
country.
be. Yeah.
Yeah, I don't think there's necessarily a larger level of that over there. You got to realize this is a Ukraine's a modern country, right? I mean,
Right.
they have McDonald's and internet and electricity and everything that we have. It's not like some backwoods
Right.
sort of third world country. I mean, they are a modern country. And so the people are very similar. People from Europe are very similar. We all kind of have the same sort of mindsets. We like to take care of our neighbors. We want to live in general peace and prosperity. So I would just say those same rules apply to Ukraine. They're just happen to be fighting for their very survival right now. And
So I
so
get, yeah. So is that I kind of maybe that's the distinction because again, I recognize they're the same. I recognize they're a modern country. I understand that, but again, we're a modern country, and yet again, I'm consistently ashamed at sometimes what happens when we have a problem. We have something like September 11th, and we do an amazing job rallying and doing something like it. Then you have something
for
like,
3 days.
yeah, 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 yeah. The other half was a week later. Um, and but then you have Katrina, where
Yeah, I remember that. Yeah.
just a few years apart from each other, and we acted with just, I mean, shamefully. Is
Yes.
so
I
so
get what you're asking.
yeah. So
Well, I
so
think
do,
one
do
thing
they
to keep
have
in
those
mind
issues
is,
there?
yeah, well, they're also a lot more homogenous than we are. America is one of the most culturally diverse countries in the world, where you have people from various value backgrounds and cultural backgrounds that think differently and behave differently. And that's just what we've done in America. It's what we've created through mass immigration, and we've lost kind of a sense of unifying identity. I don't think Ukraine suffers from that. I don't think most countries suffer from that identity crisis. And so that honestly, we probably see more of that during our times of crisis than maybe other countries do, just because we have so many different types of cultures that don't agree with each other and fight with each other. And unfortunately, that's the reality that we live in. I hate it. I wish it wasn't that way. But it is what it is. And so does Ukraine have that? I'm sure. I'm sure they have some looting. They're all not just one homogenous person. There are minorities and different cultures, religious and ethnic backgrounds. But by and large, they're all kind of the same. And so I think that's where we get our Katrinas from, is the cultural value differences.
Hmm.
It's just people are going to be good or bad, and tragedy brings it out of them. So, if the grid went down and there was no electricity, you have a choice on how you're going to treat your neighbors. You
Right.
can you can steal their stuff. You can shoot them when they come knocking on your door looking for water or milk, or you could offer them a blanket and let them use your generator with you, and that sort of stuff. And so I think a lot of that boils down to the culture that you live in and the type of people that you are.
For those, I didn't say this at the very beginning, but for those listening, Stephen and I are friends. I've known Stephen for now what,
Well,
5 years?
that's stretching the term. I don't know if we can
Well,
call you
yeah, well, yeah. I was gonna say if
friends.
you came to my door, you would not get the blanket treatment from me. Is all I'm saying. So, um,
I wouldn't get a blanket. You're telling me I wouldn't get a blanket if I'm cold,
no,
Peter?
I'm saying you wouldn't get the treatment. I'm saying you would get the other treatment if you showed up at my door. I'm
Better. Well, I'll tell you what, I've got extra beans and rice at my house. So if it goes down, I'll feed you one meal and then you're out of here.
Right. So moving between the country, like or around the country, like with you and your crew. How many total? You said it was you, a videographer. You said it was a skeleton crew. How many total people did you have in your entourage that was following you around? How many people did you have
Well,
on
I
this?
only had one person following me around. That was my videographer. But we were, grouped up with different people at different times, depending
Gotcha.
on where we were, where we were staying or where we were traveling. Um, so it just depends. Sometimes there's as many as 20 people. Sometimes there was as few as five. It just depends on, who we were connected with and where we were traveling. But by and large, the people were helpful and kind, very considerate, very hospitable. Um, telling them what we're doing and just wanting to make themselves available. Oh, okay. Let me tell you my story. Oh, let me introduce you to this person. This person's got a story. Let me tell you about them. Well, gosh, one lady, Peter, this is really wild. One lady, I talked to her. I said, where's your she'd mentioned her son. I said, where's your son at right now? And I said, is he at war? And she said, no, he has a heart condition and he has an exemption. He can't serve in the military because of his health. I said, oh, that's unfortunate. I'm sorry. And she goes, well, he's got papers from the hospital, that sort of thing. And I said, well, where's he at right now? And she said, well, a couple hours before you and I are talking, me and her, she said, just a couple hours ago, he was stopped by the police. We were out in town and the police stopped him and wanted to see his papers. In fact, they all have an app and it's like a national Ukraine app. And they said, show us your app. And the app kind of tells you everything you need to know about the person that you've stopped. And so they said, oh, why aren't you in the army? And he goes, well, I have an exemption. They said, show us your paperwork. He showed the paperwork. This is what she's telling me. And they go, well, we don't believe you. And he goes, well, these are the hospital papers. They said, well, we're going to go down to the hospital right now and do another test. So this woman said the police had taken her son to the hospital. We're at the hospital with him at that moment, running more like EKGs and stress tests and stuff to see if his heart had gotten better. And if so, they were going to send him to basic training.
Oh,
So
wow.
she was, yeah, wild stuff. Another woman told me that her husband went outside to do something. I can't remember what she told me he was doing. He was like taking the trash out or getting his mail or something, just very casually around his outside of his house. And the military stopped him. And he was supposed to be in the army and he wasn't.
The Demas's family has been in the restaurant business for many generations. We have been serving people in the Middle Tennessee market for 34 years. Try our spaghetti kits, our pot roast, which we slow cook for 4 hours, or our world famous baked chicken and rice soup, which many locals have dubbed Greek penicillin for when you feel under the weather. We make our food fresh, and upon placing our order with us, we freeze the order and send it to your house. Demas's is more than a business. 5 generations of restaurant operators have taught us many things about food, but more importantly, we have recognized that we don't sell food. We sell the experience of bringing people and families together, which our country desperately needs. So go to demasfamilykitchen.com and share in this journey today. And for right now, use the code UNCOMMON to get 10% off of your order. That's demasfamilykitchen.com.
And they just took him on the spot. Like he didn't go back in the house. He didn't get to tell his wife, hey, they've got me, I'm leaving, say goodbye to his kids or anything. Like they called her up later and said, hey, he's with us. He's at basic training, you know? And so that has caused morale to just plummet with so many people over there.
All right. So the purpose of the police then is to ensure that those who are of fighting age and those who can fight are fighting. I mean, it's not like this is a situation where we're talking about a voluntary basis, or anything of that nature. They're compelling people that if I see somebody, so I mean,
Well, they have a draft.
Yeah.
If you're between the ages of 25 and 60, you have to serve in the army.
Okay.
You don't have a choice. 25 to 60, you're in the military, unless you have 3 children. If you have 3 children, you're exempt. And there's also this unspoken rule. It's not official, so it can be broken by any police or military official if they kind of woke up on the wrong side of the bed. There's this unspoken agreement between the military and people who are chaplains or pastors or like spiritual leaders. They kind of leave those guys alone, but it's not a hard and fast rule. So yeah, you have to serve in the military. There's a draft there, and that's part of the whole rounding people up. Because at the beginning, you got to realize when Russia invaded Ukraine 3 years ago, like every Ukrainian dude was like, I'll go fight Russia. We'll go defend our nation. We want to be free. You can't have our country. That was 3 years ago. You know how many of those patriotic guys have died?
Yeah, right.
And so now you're kind of left with a bunch of dudes who don't want to go. It's terrible. It's terrible.
So while you were there, what was I'm going to ask 2 questions at the same time, and I'll let you pick which one you want to answer first. What was kind of the saddest or angriest moment you had, and what was probably the most uplifting thing you got to see while you were there?
Oh gosh, man, you're gonna make me scour my index of memory here to figure out the very best ones. The saddest moment, those are tough. Let me go to the saddest one later. Let's start with the good one. The best moments would be probably this woman who in Moldova, the country beside Ukraine, her and her husband are foster parents. and they had built like this little foster home place for kids, multiple children.
Mhm.
And they had been doing that for years. Well, then the war in Ukraine, the neighboring country, happened, and her and her husband felt compelled to do something. They wanted to serve, they wanted to help somehow, but they lived in Moldova, the country right beside Ukraine. What do we do? Well, you have all of these Ukrainian refugees leaving the country and going to random places, Moldova, other parts of Europe, America. And so what her and her husband did is they built these 6 large buildings that can house 8 families apiece in those buildings. And over the last 3 years, 42,000 refugees have passed through their care.
Wow.
It's unbelievable. She told me that number, and I thought it was like a translation issue when she was speaking English, but I thought that she's not saying 42,000. I mean, it was crazy. And I walked through, I spoke to them, and I guess what I'll do to answer the second part of your question is I'll give the saddest moment tagged in with the best moment. So that would have been a real highlight. A real low part, a real sad part was also at that exact same facility there in Moldova. I went into one of the buildings and I met one of the families that lived there. And Peter, we're talking a woman, her husband, her mother, or mother-in-law, I can't remember which one, maybe mother-in-law, um, and like 3 or 4 kids, all living in one bedroom, the whole bedroom. That was it. Just packed in there. And I sat down, I talked with her. It's in the documentary. You'll be able to hear me talk to her. And she just talks about how they had to flee Ukraine and how bombs were shelling into their apartments, and they were fearful and trying to escape. And a neighbor gave them some money, and they got out. They got out of the country and were able to flee and get to Moldova and try to rebuild and wait out the war and that sort of thing. So it was really sad to see such a large family living in one bedroom.
Right.
It wasn't even like one bedroom and then a bunch of other rooms to go to. We're talking that was all they had was that bedroom.
When I think of your title, what does freedom cost? And I know it's specific to Ukraine, but I think here in the US, we take our freedom so much for granted, that we don't recognize what other people have to do to maintain their freedom. We're not even talking about trying to earn
Yeah.
their freedom back. I mean, but to maintain their freedom. Um, you know, the threat from Putin was always real. I mean, always real to Ukraine. We don't have that constant threat here that they had growing up. Do you think we would handle it in a similar fashion with what you saw? Do you think we would understand the value of freedom if they were going through that more, or do you think we would be more culturally now to kind of roll on our back?
If we were invaded,
Yeah.
I think I think any country in the world that tried to invade the United States would be in for a very rude awakening, for a variety of reasons. Not least of which is there's like 8 guns per person in this country. Like that's one thing.
I
Um,
only got 4. I know
yeah, you're behind. Yeah, you're a rookie. You're a noob. I think that's a component. I think the mindset of Americans, the whole Gadsden flag, don't tread on
Right.
me, that sort of thing. There's like an underlying spirit in America of like, all right, come and take
Yeah,
it.
my
Like
my 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 knife my knife has it. I mean, you can
look at you, look at you. Yeah, look at you. It's that's the spirit of I dare you. I dare you
right.
to come and take it. Try it, right? And so I think Americans are more equipped and more mindset um, of thinking. Now, not currently. Currently, we're enjoying our internet and our Netflix shows and our online debates about random things. So we're not in the need to have to fight like we have been in previous generations. But I do believe that spirit still exists in us. It just hasn't been awoken because it hasn't needed to be awoken. Thankfully, I mean, you can have a time of peace or a time of war. I'm glad we live in a time of peace, relative peace in the United States. War stinks, man. I've been in war. It's not fun. It is not Hollywood and dramatic and cool. It's awful. It is awful. I'm glad we're living in peace. And but I think if we had to, yeah, I think we'd handle it really well.
All right. So what can we and I want to talk about our government, our people, et cetera. What of me, just me, people are listening to this. everyday people, what should we do? What ought we do in relation to this war of Ukraine? What do you think? Because I mean, besides help fund your money movie, using the Freedom Tree, which we'll talk about later, but
Yeah.
but just in general, if I go to one of our restaurants and I talk to the people there, what can they do, if anything?
There's nothing a person can do. I think a lot of times we feel like we can do something. For most issues in the world, there's nothing we can do. I mean, it's not like we have the ability to do anything, right?
Right.
I mean, I literally did a documentary in Ukraine, but there's not much I can do, much less people who haven't done a documentary or anything like that. So the thing I think you should do most when it comes to issues like this is say, okay, how do I learn lessons from what's happening in Ukraine and apply them to where I'm at? Right. Now, obviously, if you wanted to, you could donate money to an organization that you support, maybe that supports Ukraine. Sure, that's one way. Obviously, prayer, people of faith believe that God answers our prayers. And so people are praying for people in Russia and Ukraine that this war ends swiftly and with peace. Those are things you can do. But as far as like policy, there's not much you can do except for, well, what we just did on election day in America. We voted for a person, Donald Trump, with an eye to end the war. I think if Harris had won, then this would have been a situation where the funding for Ukraine might have exponentially increased, which would dramatically prolong the war. Um, and I'm not saying we cut off funding to end it and let Russia take over. I'm not saying that. I'm just saying Harris took a pretty different stance from Trump, no matter what Trump did. Trump could have said, I love apple pie. And she'd be like, well, I hate apple pie. We need to eat pecan pie. So if Trump says, I think we got to bring the war to a close, Harris was, I think we got to keep it going. And so I think you just have to vote in the right people that represent your interests in America. I think you have to pray, for people of faith, truly pray. You can donate money to organizations that you care about, and you can learn those lessons that are happening around the world in places like Ukraine. And you can use those to teach your children and remind you and your friends of that freedom costs. It's not just a guarantee. We're not promised freedom. We're not
Right.
told, hey, you get to be free forever and no one's ever going to challenge it. That's not how it works. So I think these are stark reminders that we live in a world where our liberty can be threatened and we shouldn't get too cozy. You should do that. That's what people should do.
I'm just shocked to hear that like not everybody in Russia and Ukraine is everybody's getting a participation trophy and just go home. I don't
That's
understand
right.
why that doesn't solve the problem.
It seems like that would do it, right? Hey, you all participated. Well done. They're not confused, are they? They understand it. Yeah. They're also not confused about other random things like if a man's a man or a woman's a woman or
Yeah,
any of that stuff. They
yeah.
all
I
that
bet
stuff.
we're not talking about the pronouns in spite of
No,
the music video that Zelensky does.
man. Oh my gosh. Good Lord. Those are first world issues. If we were at war, there's nobody in America that would be arguing about if you got misgendered.
Right,
If we were
right,
invaded by China, nobody would. No one would even. And if you were offended, everyone would have no time for you. They'd
right.
say, "Who cares?
Exactly.
We got no bit. We don't care how you feel." Right? That's Ukraine or Russia. So, yeah, that's a luxury that we have. All this stuff
All right. So
to have the argument.
how do we find your movie? How do we find about it? And then what can we do to help support that movie and getting out? Because I agree, your movie getting out and letting people see what could happen to us over here. Yeah, and again, not maybe directly, but in that possibility of losing our liberty. What can freedom cost us, or what does freedom cost? I should say. How do they find it? How do they find out how to
Yeah,
support it?
yeah. Thanks. Let me plug the website here. We'll do a little push. That's it's really easy. You can find it, the movie and all that stuff places, but I would just always direct people back to thefreedomtree.com, thefreedomtree.com. And at the Freedom Tree, if people say, well, what's the Freedom Tree? So I don't have a big studio behind me. I didn't have a bunch of money or backers doing this. I'm an Army vet. I love freedom. I love liberty and telling the stories of people that, kind of along those themes that matters to me. I've lived it and I care when I hear it. And so that's where this Ukraine documentary was born, the desire to tell the stories of the Ukrainian people. This wasn't a political documentary. It wasn't like this is a pro-Trump documentary. This is a pro-Harris documentary. It wasn't left or right. It wasn't Democrat Republican. This was a documentary just to get over there and tell freedom stories, to tell the costs of war, so people could have their voices heard. And to do that, because I don't have cash, I'm not loaded up with money to do this. I said, well, how can we inspire people to support these things? And so that's where the Freedom Tree was born. The Freedom Tree is a 15-foot tall fake tree. It's really beautiful, really well crafted by a master craftsman, with red, white, and blue leaves. And the leaves are different amounts, and there are gold leaves as well, much more expensive gold leaves, but you can buy leaves. The leaves are purchasable, just like when you walk into a park and you see a brick, and the brick says like the Demas family, the Solomon family, the company here, this, the company there. The people are supporting the park by buying bricks. That's what you can do with the Freedom Tree. You could literally purchase leaves. So people visit thefreedomtree.com. They see the mission, they see the documentary, they see what I'm trying to do here, and they want to support it. And so they buy a leaf. It's really terrific. And I take that money. It's not going in my pocketbook. It's going into an account for the Freedom Tree documentaries, because we're going to do more. Syria, for instance, just fell, and Bashar al-Assad took off to Moscow. The guy was a dictator there for 40 years. Well, now there's a new Islamic group in charge of Syria, and everyone's wondering what freedom is going to look like now. I mean, they were under Assad for 40 years, now under this group. I'd love to go over there and tell that story, do a documentary, tell that story. These things cost money. These things cost effort and time, hiring videographers, my own time. And the way I decided that we could kind of pull together behind this mission is the Freedom Tree. So if you're interested, if what you're hearing inspires you, or you want to support what I'm doing, I would encourage you, visit thefreedomtree.com and buy a leaf. And I would really appreciate that. That makes a big difference. It makes a huge difference.
In Acts 5, we see that when Peter and the other disciples were ordered to stop talking about Jesus, they responded, "We obey God and not man." In 2020, we saw something we never thought we could see in this country. They shut down our churches. After decades of removing God from schools and public institutions, they went straight at our community. Unfortunately, we as Christians did not know what to do. And even worse, we chose to listen to false prophets masquerading as Christians on how to respond. I recognize this is the only beginning, and we need to know how to respond. We have a duty to say no to unjust laws, but as Christians, we have a greater duty to God. In my book, On the Duty of Christian Civil Disobedience, I use biblical teachings to help believers know when and how to stand up to those in charge when they ask us to commit evil. You can go to peterdemas.org to find out about our duty to say no. And when you type in the code UNCOMMON, you can get 10% off your order. That's uncommon at peterdemas.org. Remember, we are to obey God and not man. I just got on the website to help. It's real simple. When you go to thefreedomtree.com, up at the top right corner, it says add your name to the tree, and you click it, and there's the 4 leaves there. It's that simple. It's that easy to do.
It's that simple.
Yeah,
literally. Yeah.
Yeah. Now, when you do it, you're not going to be showing up at their door asking, every day, like, "Hey, I got a camera. You're going to donate more." It's none of that type stuff. You just
every single day. Yeah, every day we'll be at everybody's houses all the time. "Hey, we noticed you bought a red leaf. We're looking for a blue leaf now, and next week a white leaf." Yeah, no, we're just asking people. This is just like buying a brick in a park. I'm not going to come knocking on everybody's doors or anything. You add your name to the tree, put your name on a leaf, it goes on the tree. It's really beautiful. It's a great way for people to rally behind this idea of freedom and liberty. Ukraine is one story of many. There's a lot of stories, Peter, in the United States that need to be told about freedom. We could go out overseas all day long, and I want to do more, but I also want to tell US based stories, because there are people here in the US who have had their liberty stripped, that have had their freedom taken away.
Yes.
These types of stories need to be told. And so that, again, it just takes money. I'm really kind of a one-man show. And so this helps it helps me to hire videographers and editors and a team to build and to grow, and to not just tell casual stories, but to tell stories that really matter from the ground, to get, like I said, with Ukraine, to get the US story out of it, and Ukraine and the Russian stories out of it, those narratives, and just hear it from the people. Isn't there something powerful about hearing from people themselves? Isn't there something powerful when you get to hear from the locals on the ground that are dealing with things, and they just tell you their story and what they're going through and how the war has impacted them, that's powerful. And that's what this is all about.
Well, I think it's good. I mean, and we know that mainstream media is not trustworthy. I mean, I'm not saying they don't tell the truth about Ukraine. I'm not saying they do. We just know they're not trustworthy, and we don't know what is true and what isn't. We don't
Yeah, what a
know.
world.
Yeah, and then the same thing true with people like me or other podcasters that have these opinions. We're basing it off of something, but that's what I love about documentaries and I know that documentaries can be leaned, et cetera. But I like what you're
Of course they
doing.
can.
Yeah, I mean, I love what you're doing though with it. You're
Thanks.
again, you're just telling the story. I think that's awesome because I
That's what
think
it
that's
is.
the best way for us to learn and know what's going on and know how we can either impact Ukraine or how Ukraine can impact us. I think that's amazing.
Man, I really appreciate that. It was a lot of effort. It was a lot of work. And I'm really pleased with the product. Obviously, it wasn't done like a Hollywood style movie. It's a documentary by a guy with a camera in Ukraine, but that to me is kind of part of the compelling nature of it. We just kind of leaned into that. We said, you know
Right.
what? This is just raw. It's not some super high end Marvel Cinematic Universe production. This is just real deal stuff. And so, if people are interested in hearing stories of sacrifice, stories of nonprofits that are doing work, and women who had to leave their husbands behind, and soldiers who lost friends, you just want to hear what's going on there. I would encourage you check out thefreedomtree.com and watch that documentary.
All right. Well, that sounds great. Again, Freedom Tree, thefreedomtree.com.
Mhm.
Highly recommend you do it. Stephen, thank you so much for coming on. I appreciate it. I look forward to your next project on it, and
I appreciate that.
hopefully we can do something together on that.
Well, I've got one emergency meal waiting for you when the grid goes down. Keep that in mind. That's all you get.
Okay, and I will trade it for a blanket. It won't
A
be maybe a
blanket,
full-size
one
blanket.
blanket.
I'm thinking maybe, like a blankie. Um,
Just something that barely covers my top, just right here. Let's shiver a little bit.
might be a
That's good.
hanky.
Thanks so
I
much.
mean, I don't
Yeah,
know.
just a little hanky. I mean, at that point, I'll just find someone else with friends like with that who needs enemies.
All right, well, thank you again. I appreciate it. God bless you.
Thanks.